So hopefully we'll be able to bring you some headlines, or we may hear about them anyway, from our guest speaker. So let me introduce you to him. He is chairman of the Committee on Climate Change. He's also the longest-serving Secretary of State for the Environment and has 16 years of top-level ministerial experience. He's also the founder and the CEO of Sancroft, the corporate relations consultancy, and that advises blue-chip companies all around the world. Today, he's going to tell us what he thinks about the challenge of climate change, how it's going to shape the UK economy, food supplies, and therefore the cold chain. So please give a very warm welcome to the Right Honourable Lord Deben, Chairman, the Committee on Climate Change.
The process that is going on at the moment is going, of course, to alter the way which people think immediately, but not actually. Because the fascinating thing about the cost of living crisis is that what we have to do for that, apart from any immediate action on bills, is exactly what we have to do to reach net zero. It's about making energy cheaper by making it renewable, which we've made the cheapest way of producing electricity that there is. Of course, it wasn't until we created a market. And the market was created. And now what is called the bill for that, of course, is entirely a legacy bill. We're only paying for the extra costs that we created in order to bring on stream the offshore wind industry. Now, the offshore wind industry is selling electricity to the market at a price which we would not have considered possible before. If you started up a gas-fired enterprise now, you'd be paying 5 times the cost of what we have for regenerative electricity production from offshore. And actually, if it's onshore, it's even cheaper for the obvious reasons. But offshore has advantages, not least that the wind blows more often and longer in most of the places offshore. And of course, we're immensely lucky in Britain because we do have what other people don't have, which is the remains of the continental shelf, the bit that used to join us to the rest of Europe. Remind us that we are part of Europe. That bit gives us a very shallow channel, which enables us to do this even more effectively than others. But now with floating offshore wind, we will find it possible to go to places which we've never done before. And by doing this, of course, we have created an industry for the rest of the world and have given to the rest of the world the opportunity of producing offshore wind in a way which no one thought possible before. I start there partly because my own history was being the chairman of an offshore wind company, and I have to say, we were producing electricity at about 200 units, 200, whatever way you like to put it, but it cost 200 pence for a certain amount. That certain amount is now down to 47 pence. What a totally different situation that is. And of course, it gives us security too. And if ever we needed that, I caught the tail end of one of the answers that someone gave about what is the next crisis. As she's there, I will say I disagree with you. We knew perfectly well that we could have a pandemic because we'd had them before. What we were foolish about was not actually doing something about it. And so it came as, and then of course people say it's unprecedented. That's a convenient word to make sure that the government doesn't get blamed for the fact that it wasn't properly prepared for. And the same is true of the war in Ukraine, which I think you rightly said. We got ourselves into such an odd world, didn't we? We believed that there'd never be another war in Europe, and yet that is just not a sensible policy. And the other thing is, we believed that we'd always be able to buy fuel anywhere in the world, and we'd always be able to get food. Well, I remember when I was Minister of Agriculture, I was interviewed by the cleverest man in Europe, Peter Jay. And Peter Jay interviewed me. He said, there's no reason for a Minister of Agriculture, is there? Because we can always get food anywhere. We don't need to grow it ourselves. We can always do it. What a wrong attitude that was to the world in which we live. And so when we come to climate change, my first thing to say to people is, for goodness sake, those people who were deniers now know they can't deny because the science is so obvious. And after this hot weather, if you don't understand that the climate is changing, then really, I don't know which cold store you've been living in. Because the truth is it's clearly changing and clearly changing much faster than people thought it was going to do. So deniers have now become delayers. They now say, well, of course, it'd be quite convenient, not quite to do these things. And, can we do net zero in these circumstances? Well, any investigation, and I know that the government will be looking at whether the way we're getting to net zero might be different in the context. The truth of the matter is that net zero is necessary. And it's necessary for a very simple reason. If just over 1 degree of warming could create weather throughout the world like we've just had, just think what 3 times that would do, and that is what we're at now, unless we make the changes that we need to make. That's the truth of where we are. And I want to start with that truth because unless we stick to that, we will find ourselves in a situation in which we will, as businesses, not be prepared. Now, I've been a businessman all my life, except for the 16 years as a minister in successive governments. And the one thing I do know about being a business is that you need to be there when it hits you. There is no point in believing that you should allow yourself not to change in advance in as far as you can. And there are in the world, but climate change is one of them. And therefore we know that people are going to have to deal with climate change. And the more we make our businesses resilient in advance, then the less we will have to make changes at the behest of government. And I've always believed that the less the government does, the better, and the more that we do in the way which is most convenient for our businesses, because we know what they are, the better we do it and the cheaper it becomes. So what should we be asking if we accept as businesses? We have got to recognise that net zero is a reality. It's the quickest thing we can manage, 2050, but it's only just nip and tuck to be enough if we do it. The whole world is signed up to it. Of course, they won't do it in the same way they want to, and no doubt they'll fall behind and we'll have to ratchet them up and we'll have more cops to do it and press them, the rest of it. But the truth is, there's nothing else the world is signed up to, and clearly that's the direction it's going into. What is it that we should be asking as from industry of government? And for me, at the heart of that is systemic understanding. Governments are very bad at understanding systems. They do bits, and that's because they're siloed by. So departments don't really think through what the holistic answer is. And that's why, for me, the central issue that we have is how do we make a system capable of carrying the electricity that we need for the whole range of activities that we need it for. How do we do that? It's clear that it can be done and should be done, but we have to be frank about what it means. We have a system which was built for what the French used to call centrales. It's a very good word for a generating station. They were central, big things, and they sent electricity out. We don't have that system any longer. We've now got a number of those, but we've got all sorts of distributed mechanisms, and it will increasingly be true as we use motor cars to be part of the way we are going to store electricity, as we interrelate the way in which the family uses its electricity and our ability to flatten out peaks. All those things will mean that we will become a different system. And I suppose my first concern is that neither government nor indeed the national grid is really on to this in the way it ought to be. Now, the government's made some changes. One, I'm pleased that it's done what it should have done a long time ago, which is to remove from the national grid the fundamentally conflict of interest that it used to have, and the new system ought to be better. But it's the urgency which is crucially important if we're to get that right, because that is essential. The second thing we have to do is to deal with the provision of the electricity. And that does mean that the government plans for more offshore wind, more onshore wind, and nuclear are all necessary. I just wish we'd had it earlier. If we had it earlier, we'd have taken a significant amount off everybody's bills. That's actually true. If we had not had that nonsense about the green crap, then we would in fact have done the things that we were going to do. It would have changed people's bills today, which is why we've got to be very careful at this moment that because of the pressures, government doesn't think this is a moment to hold things back. That would be the worst possible step, both for bills and indeed for our ability to compete in the future. So we need a programme which has to be accelerated, if anything. I think we've got to be a bit sensible about how we make choices in the nuclear area. And I am unhappy that the nuclear industry has so far failed ever to produce anything on time and on budget. And that does make it a real issue about the government's discussions with Sizewell. I have to be a bit careful about that because I live about 40 miles, well, perhaps 30 miles from Sizewell, so I might be considered as biased, except I used to represent the constituency where Sizewell is, and I fought very hard for Sizewell B. But the truth is, we've moved on very considerably from them, and part of the levelling up might be that we want to put nuclear power stations in Wilfer and in the northwest, where people are particularly concerned to have it. We've got to think very hard about how all these things for climate change fit into the other policies that we have. So the second thing is we're going to have to extend and increase the amount of energy that we're producing. But the third thing is, and it's a thing that you have been talking about, is we've really got to learn to use energy much more efficiently. And energy efficiency has always been the problem for politicians. They don't like dealing with energy efficiency because they don't think there are any votes in it. See, if you build something big, then you can point to it and say, look, we've built this. But if you say people are now using 5% less energy to get the same thing, somehow or other that doesn't ring at all. And yet we are using much less energy to do many of the things that we do, largely because of the very sensible policies of the European Union. Remember that ridiculous argument of Dyson, complaining that there were going to be rules about how much energy you could use for his vacuum cleaners. Well, the effect is that we now get just as much sucking at a very much lower amount of electricity by setting standards, and that is crucially important. And one of the things we've got to keep this government to is not to go back on that, because we need to raise those standards constantly, because always, if you challenge people on technology, then you can deliver. I once had a big argument with one Labour spokesman, and in the end I said to him, look, the problem with you, you're a convert. You used to believe only in nationalisation, now you believe in the in the free enterprise system, and you believe businessmen. I don't believe businessmen because I am a businessman. I know perfectly well that I'm in favour of competition for everybody else, but I wouldn't mind a monopoly for me. That's a general attitude. You just have to believe that. So, if that's the case, what you have to ask business is just this side of the impossible. It has to be this side of the impossible, but don't give way to people who tell they can't do it. And that's exactly what's happened in our white goods industry. The ability now to produce really good dishwashers and really good washing machines using much less water and much less electricity than we ever did before was in the teeth of opposition of people like Whirlpool who said you couldn't do it. And of course, in the United States, they didn't do it. They did do it here in the rest of Europe, and we've now got a very much better system. And that has to go on. We have to use less in that way. And that's a very useful way because the customer doesn't really notice it. But the big problem is, how do we get people to be more energy efficient? And that means that we really do have to have a proper programme of energy efficiency. It's not good enough to have a situation in which our homes leak energy in the way in which they do. And if you really want to deal with the energy price rises today, you may have to have immediate help to people for their bills. In the end, the only real way to help them is to make sure that their homes don't need the same amount of electricity, energy in general, that they do now. That's what we have to do. So, and we were doing it. The awful thing is that if you look back to the mid-2010s, we were actually helping people in very large measure to make their homes more efficient. And then, because of the green crap stuff, we stopped doing it. And now we're hardly doing it at all, except through the very good programmes of local government. And we have been supporting that. The government has really got to have a proper energy efficiency policy in which it does three things. It helps the poorest in a direct way. It makes it easier for people to know what they should do. It's absolutely mad at the moment. They don't know what to do. I during the last 18 months, bought an electric car and a heat pump. Buying an electric car, if you have the money, is the easiest thing in the world. There are a whole lot of people out there who want to sell it to you. They know about selling. They can do it. You try buying a heat pump. It's madness. And I'm the chairman of the Climate Change Committee. I ought to know how to buy a heat pump. I have to tell you, it's very hard indeed. Because the first thing that happens is that somebody comes round the house and says, "Oh, Lord Deben, well, of course, it's very good at heat pumps, but not for your house." Now, I've got a very good gas condensing boiler, which I mean, not quite as good as the heat pump, of course, but I think you find it very satisfactory. No, I want a heat pump. I want to have the system. I'm afraid not for your house. Then you have somebody who's a cowboy who'll sell you anything which won't work. After that, you've really got to understand what you need. And the government has got to find ways of helping people to do that. So a proper information thing. You ought, when you think of all those houses in the country, which are more or less the same, 3-bedroomed, 4-bedroomed, semi-detached houses, you could do all of those with standard things. We don't do it. The government can do that. And the third thing the government can do is there's a plenty of money available to lend to people to make the changes they need. You need a system, and the government has to stand behind that system. We know perfectly well we can do all we need to do for net zero for less than 1% of the gross national product. It's a tiny amount, and most of that's from the private sector. But the government has got to make it possible for the private sector to invest. And that's what concerns me about the kind of language which is sometimes used, and which I fear may be used today, which somehow or other casts doubt on the absolute conformity of the need for climate change and net zero and the things you have to do to lower bills. They are the same. So if you try to pretend in some way that it's convenient to divide them, you lead people to be less certain about the direction in which you have to go. And we have to be very careful about that. And so I'm looking to a government that really does do something about energy efficiency. Now I end with your own industry. It's fascinating about how one of your panellists was saying that the great thing that happened is the government has understood much more about supply chain as a result of this. I say something else. I think business has begun to understand supply chain much more. In the business that I run in Sancroft, where we do a lot of work on things like modern slavery, about geopolitical issues, a huge amount of work about how people ensure that their supply chains are secure. The first thing that we have shown inevitably is the very, very poor information that people have about their supply chains. It's quite amazing. Big businesses, a very large business which was not unadjacent to Coca-Cola, was unable to send out its tins in one country because although it thought it knew about its supply chain, but nobody had checked on where the glue for the packaging came from. And of course it came from somewhere where they had no alternative. We have a very large number of people we work with in the textile industry. And there's one big company which said to me, well, we thought we were protected because we brought in our clothes from 7 different countries. What we hadn't checked was that they got their material from one country. So when China closed down, they couldn't make our clothes. Now, I say that to you because I think one of the things that we have to do is to make people much more aware of the nature of the supply chain. Now, you're at the centre of it, and most people know about how their bit of the supply chain does, but I hope we get much better about our bit of the supply chain, the thing that makes it possible for us to be in the cool chain. And there are some very small things which can easily put those things wrong. So the supply chain for me is absolutely crucial. Fascinated to hear about the amount of change that will take place. I hope we'll be a bit more sensible about embodied carbon when we come to alter things. It may well be that we can offset some of the costs because that means that we can use the embodied carbon. There may be ways which we can do that. But it is hugely important for the industry to recognise that more and more people will be asking, what is the cost to the planet of what I am doing? And if that is the case, the better we are at doing it, the more we are likely to get the business. And lastly, I hope we stand up for ourselves. Business is absolutely at the heart of the changes we have to make. We're not going to do what we have to do unless business is in the forefront. And you are ahead of the government in lots of ways. And bringing pressure upon the government to make sure that the changes are there, because the only way in which you don't get undermined by those who aren't doing the right thing is if there are standards to make sure that everybody reaches towards the same end. So the best of luck, and we're in this, as they say, together. If we want to deal with the cost of living crisis, then we also have to keep our eye absolutely fixed on net zero by 2050.